Hello friends, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink, back with another Halloween card. Today I'm using the Picket Fence Studios Triple Trouble clear stamps. This stamp is huge. The panel I'm working on is 4.5 by 6.5 inches. Just to give you an idea how big this stamp is, it's big. So I have some Simon Says Stamp Smooth White cardstock here in my MISTI, and I'm inking up the pumpkins with intense black ink. I'm going to stamp them a couple times because, again, big stamp, a lot of solid areas, all that stuff. And then after I stamp it, I wasn't thinking I cleaned off my stamp. I shouldn't have bothered cleaning it off because I'm going to stamp the image onto masking paper. And when I stamp on masking paper, I just usually will use whatever residual ink is left on my stamp because it doesn't need to be perfect. But like I said, I cleaned off the stamp and then I was like, oh yeah. So I just lightly inked up the stamp. I only need to mask off like the top portion, so I'm not going to bother doing the entire thing. I'm not going to waste my masking paper. So I stamped it onto the masking paper and then I just trim it out right on the line with my little cutter bee scissors. These are just my go-to scissors for fussy cutting and detail cutting and all the things. So I trimmed out my mask, and then I also have the Tim Holtz moon mask set because I wanted to put a moon in the background. I was heavily inspired by a recent video Nicole Spohr did. She did a Halloween video and she made a couple cards in it. And the one she did with like the spooky green background, which funny enough, she said she was inspired by another maker and my brain has stopped. But that combo she was inspired by, and then I was inspired by her. So it's like inspiration inception in a way. So I loved it. And I was just, the whole time, in the back of my mind, I was thinking Nicole's card. So yeah, very much inspired by her. She makes fabulous cards. I just love it. So I have my little moon mask and I just used some repositionable adhesive on the back of it. And I masked off the top of the pumpkins. And then I am blending Twisted CITRON Distress Oxide ink over that. And then I'm adding Rustic Wilderness, which is one of my like go-to combos. I love, there's something about Rustic Wilderness and Twisted CITRON together. Like when I was doing watercoloring with like the Distress Reinkers a couple months ago, I was using that combo a lot because there's just something about it. So I did those two, and then I added a bit of Black Soot Distress Oxide. Not a lot, I didn't use a heavy hand with that, but just a bit to kind of deepen it. And then I splattered a bit of water onto the background. You're not going to get an intense water reaction because this is just Simon's Smooth White cardstock. If I'd used heavy stock or like distressed watercolor paper, etc., you get more reaction, but I just wanted this little subtle reaction, and then I'm going to, of course, add more splatter. So after that was all done, I removed the moon mask and I used just my little Xyron adhesive eraser to remove little bits of adhesive. And then I used the coordinating moon stencil with some pumice stone Distress Oxide ink and just lightly blended that on top, which just makes it perfect. So after I blended that over the stencil, I'm going to remove the stencil and without re-inking my blending brush, just whatever little bit is kind of left on there, I'm just going to kind of swirl it over that moon so it's not so stark white. So just kind of lightly went over it. Also because I had a couple little areas that smeared a bit. I make so many mistakes with this card, especially when I start using the black oxide ink and the bat stencil, but I'll get to that. That's what I'm going to do next. So I kept the mask on the pumpkins in place and I pulled out the Simon Says Stamp layered bats stencil. Love. I already did a separate video using these like dedicated as my focus, but I wanted to have this like background. So I should have either taped down or used the magnets that are right in front of my face to hold the stencil down rather than holding it with my fingers because I slipped a couple times and I made, a couple little smears with the ink on the bats. It's not as apparent on camera, but it was really obvious in real life. But I was like, I'll fix that. So I did. I went over the one bat that I smeared with a larger bat and ink blended just using Simon's smaller blending brush. And then I created another smear and I'm like, oh my God. I was like, I can't win. Why? So I just added a bat on top of that. We're good to go. there was still like, again, I don't know how well it shows up on camera, but you could still see it. But I was like, I'm going with it. I'm not redoing this. You know, we're just going to go with it and I'll let it splatter later, etc. So I've got my bats in place. I'm going to remove the mask so that I can color all of these pumpkins in. And the coloring is going to be quite simple because they're just pumpkins, not a whole lot of detail or anything like that. So I did my go-to color combo for pumpkins, which is YR 04, 07, and 09. But I also added this E09 just to intensify it a little bit, since these are such huge images and they're kind of the focus of the card. And I've sped this up big time in editing because, yeah, otherwise it's just that my videos would be way too long. But this was very simple coloring. I just went darkest to lightest, as is tradition with me, because it's just quicker. And yeah, no fancy techniques or tips here at all, really. As always, I'm not following any sort of rules, especially in regards to a light source, because technically, if we're getting like specific here, the light source is behind these. You know, the moon is technically the light source. So these would actually be darker, yada, yada, yada. No. This is why I tell you guys, I don't follow those rules. Because then it's just like, if you really want to know about like light sources and doing the proper shading and adding shadows and making things look amazing, like check out Sandy Allnock's YouTube channel. She has so much info and beautiful coloring and all that stuff. And I love watching it and seeing how she'll take a stamped image and just make it into this amazing scene. Highly recommend. So, like I said, I don't follow the rules because I just don't. So I colored the pumpkins, and then I used the same browns to do the ground and the stems. Again, just keeping her simple. After I'd finished coloring it in, I took my darkest brown and did a bunch of dots along the bottom just to add texture. So dotted that all over the place. Off camera, I used my heat tool to make sure this was dry, because oxides take longer to dry, especially when you're putting them on thickly, stenciling with them, all the things. And this needed to be dry. So I made sure either leave it overnight to let it dry or use your heat tool. So I made sure it was dry, but I tested it regardless. So I used my anti-static powder tool over the surface of this, and then I just poured my embossing powder on it just to see. Because if the embossing powder clings to everything, you know it's not dry and you're not going to have a good time. So it was dry. The embossing powder wasn't clinging to anything. I still used my anti-static powder tool again. And then I'm stamping a sentiment from that triple trouble set. I love how it's curved, so it fits like right over that center pumpkin. So I stamped that twice with clear embossing ink because I wanted to make sure I got a really good impression because it's a very solid sentiment. And then I coated it with Simon's white embossing powder. Made sure to brush off any random little bits that decided to cling along, just because that always happens. And then I melted that with my heat tool. And then to make it stand out a little bit more, because, you know, busy background, the colors, everything, I just took this W5 Copic marker and just kind of added that little bit of shading around the sentiment, kind of avoiding the heat embossing. If you're not aware of that, there is something about heat embossed lines, images, whatever, that can react with Copic markers. It can ruin the tips of your Copics. That's why you never see me heat emboss images and then color them in with Copics. I would color, you know, stamp it in one color, keep it in my MISTI, color it, and then heat emboss over it if I wanted to. Some people do it and they don't have a problem. I'm not willing to risk my markers with that. My Copics cost me a small fortune. So I do not recommend. But with this, I was not like barely touching the heat embossing. You know, just very light little bits just to add that tiny bit of shading and it's good to go. So after that was done, of course, I'm going to add a ton of splatter. I've got my little palette here that has some white gouache in this one well, and I actually added a bunch of Perfect Pearl powder to it. So it's more Perfect Pearl than gouache. So I've got like that shimmery mixture. And I'm using my Zen fan brush again. I'm total convert. Love it for splatter. Love it. The handle is ridiculous. I mentioned this in my last video when I was using this. This handle is literally ridiculous. Like, I measured. It's a foot. This brush is a foot long. I don't understand why it's like this. I don't get it, but I don't care. Using the fan brush is just, it makes really, really nice splatters. So that makes me happy. So I splattered the ever-living crap out of this thing because that's just what you do. Once I had that splatter added, I'm going to add more splatter. I'm going to add black soot distress paint. So shook that up really well. I've washed my brush off. That's why it kind of looks funny. And then just added the splatter with the fan brush and the black soot distress paint. And like I've always said, distress paint dries permanent. So once you're done, whatever project you're using, whether you're splattering or painting or whatever with it, wash your brush, wash whatever you've put it on, you know. So I washed my little plastic palette. I washed it off immediately because, again, this paint is permanent. So splattered absolutely everything. I was kind of keeping it somewhat more to the edges, you know, not holding the brush right over the very center. Like I didn't want to cover the pumpkins completely. And then once the splatter's dry, I had in the back of my mind this whole time, I was like, do I want to use my white gel pen? Like, do I need to? And I decided to. Again, not following light source rules, especially because, again, if I was, there wouldn't be all these highlights because the light source is behind it. But I just wanted to kind of emphasize the eyes and the open mouths of these pumpkins. So I took my white gel pen and just went along. People always ask me, like, for tips, you know, directions on where to place. I don't follow light sources. I don't follow rules. I just put them where I like. You know, it's just like, I think it'll look good here. A little line here, a dot here. Yeah. I wish I could be more helpful with the white gel pen dilemma, but honestly, the more you do it, you just get comfortable with it. I remember struggling with it way back in the day and just, you know, that's why I get it. Because I would watch other people's videos and see them, you know, and I was like, how do they know where to place it? You just kind of start figuring it out after a while, you know? Yeah. I just kind of went along, added a few. I was like, ooh, a line will look good here, a little highlight here. And yeah. And then if it's really bad or, you know, you're just not happy with it, add some more splatter and it'll be good. So I did all that, set it aside. And then I have another panel of just white cardstock. And I'm going to put this in my MISTI. And I've shown this in a bunch of videos. I've done this with blending brushes, but I've also used my blending foams that are like really saturated with Oxide inks. Either one works for this. I just grab my blending brushes because they're sitting right in front of me. So I have Carved Pumpkin, Crackling Campfire, and Ground Espresso Distress Oxide inks. This works best with something like an Oxide ink or a pigment ink. And I'm just picking up the color with the brush and then applying it to the stamp and then stamping this onto that white cardstock. And then I get this multicolor image. Using the blending brushes, it's a little bit lighter than it would be with the foams. But if you wanted, you could just ink it up. Because again, using a MISTI, you could blend the colors on it a second time and stamp it a second time to make it more intense. But since this is going on the inside of the card, I don't want it intense. So I was happy with how it was. So I did that. And then I lined up the sentiment from this set and stamped that with black ink. And then my card base is some black cardstock that I had trimmed down to 10 inches by 7, scoring it at 5 inches because this will be a 5 by 7 card. And since it's a black card base, that's why I did the separate white piece to go on the inside. Just makes it a little easier. Sometimes I don't bother because it's like, I'll just write to the recipient with a gel pen. Like a white gel pen looks fabulous on black cardstock. But this gave me the opportunity to stamp those pumpkins in the sentiment like I did, so it just works. So I adhered that to the inside of my card. Once that's adhered into place, for the card front, I had just trimmed down some random scraps of white cardstock. I have this pile and people always ask me, like, what's the brand? There's nothing to name and shame. This is literally just like old cardstock in my stash that I don't like. And I don't even remember half the time what brand it is. I just didn't like it for like blending. It doesn't work well with Copic markers, that sort of thing. But I wasn't just going to throw it out. So that sort of thing, great for adding dimension. If I don't want to use this, I'll just use foam tape. Again, it just depends on my mood. So I adhered a few layers together. So this just gives it that little bit of dimension that I love. And then as a last little like addition, I'm going to add a bit of bling. Again, this was inspired by Nicole's video because she added a little stars to her backgrounds and I was like, ooh, I like that. I like it a lot. So, and I've had this little bag of, these are Little Things by Lucy's cards, Twinkle Twinkle embellishments. And I've literally had these sitting on my desk for weeks. So I pulled those out aka pulled them onto screen, and then just adhered them into place with dabs of craft tacky glue. This also works because I was able to cover up a couple of those smears from the black ink. And yeah, if splatter doesn't fix it, put an embellishment on it and you're good to go. So that was this super fun Halloween card. As always, I will have a link below the video to my blog post. I will have links to all the supplies I used, so you can check that out in the description box below the video, and then it's picture links on my blog. So it's all there below if you're interested. Thank you all so much for watching, for subscribing, for thumbs upping, for commenting. I appreciate you all so very much, and I'll see you guys very soon in the next video. Bye!